in the Brain update. Kristen is our operations coordinator and I'm the director. We're really thrilled to have you here. And thank you for taking time to take care of yourself and to get new information and join your fellow friends who are also looking to take care of themselves. Julie's here. She's a really special presenter. She's done a lot of talks. Actually, before COVID, she traveled the state talking to people about self-care and really how to avoid, use mindfulness and use these everyday things in our life. So we pivoted our COVID in the Brain, which had been focusing on the vaccine. It had been focusing on how COVID impacts the brain. When Julie did a January event around PTSD, we started seeing a lot of healthcare providers register, and they themselves reported just a lot of stress and trauma from the last year. So we asked Julie to come in and do a session just for our healthcare heroes on the front line. Everyone is welcome. Even if you are not a healthcare worker, you will probably get a lot out of today's session. So Julie, thank you for joining us. She's with Chopra Global, and she's also a Scottsdale, practices in Scottsdale as an integrative health medicine professional, Fountain Hills as an integrative medicine professional. So Julie, thank you for joining us. She's also been one of our board leaders for the last 5 years, helping us look at brain health and wellness in addition to brain injury.
Thank you, Carrie. Can you hear me okay? You hear me okay? Okay, excellent. Thank you, everybody. I'm so pleased to be here today with you. As Carrie said, the impetus for the talk was that a lot of healthcare providers during specifically the COVID-19 pandemic were experiencing really high levels of stress and burnout. And it transformed a little bit into a talk where others might want to join in. They might not in particular be a healthcare worker, but in some way we're all caring for others. You might be caring for children at home. It could be that you're caring for a loved one with a brain injury. Maybe it's for aging parents, but truly self-care, the reduction of stress is for everybody. So we will cover a few concepts that pertain to healthcare providers, but it is for everybody. And so what you'll see here to get us started is a 2020 survey done by Mental Health America that took a look at a variety of healthcare workers during the COVID pandemic. And as you can see, across the board, reports showed elevated levels of stress, anxiety, frustration, burnout, and generally being overwhelmed. Now, once again, you didn't have to be a healthcare provider to describe some of these things going on in your own life. When we were quarantined, when individuals were worried about keeping their jobs and worrying about, were we going to be able to pay the bills? Are any of my loved ones going to become sick? Just really navigating that unknown. And so we're just going to talk about 3 pillars on burnout that pertain to healthcare providers. Then we'll move into a little bit more of the general population. But healthcare providers of all types, whether you're an MD, a nurse practitioner, a physical therapist, there's an abundance of administrative tasks. Now, you might even have administrative tasks at home if you're not a healthcare worker, but these are things like documentation and paperwork, reading labs, calling patients, liability concerns, going over formularies, all kinds of administrative tasks. And we all have those at home, right? We have to pay bills and keep all the paperwork straight. Where healthcare providers are concerned, there's real specific pillar that has to do with patient care. And as healthcare providers, we have a psychological strain of treating patients who are sick, they're afraid, some might be in the end stages of life. We have to deliver bad news. We often have patients that pass away. We treat and care for end of life and chronically ill patients. Sometimes the day is stacked with too many patients. it can be really overwhelming. And that third pillar is whether you're that healthcare provider managing those administrative tasks and those patient care tasks, we still have a home life. And so every single person watching right now has a home life. And at any given time, we're not necessarily talking about all the wonderful things that happen at home. Here we're looking at, we could be experiencing relationship issues, caring for children, navigating difficult family issues, trying to manage financial pressures, keeping the home and the car, and managing personal health challenges. We often have in our own families individuals who are struggling with brain injury, maybe mental health issues. And so these are three of the pillars that exist. And if we look at these pillars, we can see that they existed way before COVID. And then COVID comes along and it adds this whole new layer onto this mountain, this growing mountain of life that we already experience. So let's go back to start and ask ourselves, again, I would say for those watching, we're all caretakers, right? We all care for somebody. And so, and for the healthcare providers out there, why do you become a healthcare provider? Generally, individuals who do are people that are caring and compassionate, and they have this desire to help serve and heal others and make a difference. And so the question goes into exactly what this talk is about, and it's essentially what happens. And there is this incredible thing that happens called burnout that's very real, and it looks a little different for a variety of professions, but what leads to it and how it manifests in our life is generally the same. Essentially, if this constant stress and strain has you feeling helpless, overwhelmed, and exhausted, that is a pretty good indication that you're suffering with some level of burnout. Oftentimes, the problems in your life might feel a little bit insurmountable, like, can I deal with one more thing? Oftentimes in burnout, things look a little bleak. And so that might look like looking out into the world. We might have this feeling that is beginning to emerge that when we once felt very hopeful, we might feel like things in the world look really bad and they're a little hopeless. And then we might even turn those feelings inward and start to feel like my own life is feeling a bit hopeless. So that's that second piece of burnout. And the third generally comes from a state of exhaustion. And oftentimes it has to do with stress hormones. We can see this really clearly in populations who have very high stress levels. So this might be a police officer, it could be a soldier, it could be a firefighter, a healthcare provider, it could be anybody at home watching. When we have these high stress levels, we release stress hormones. And then once we come down off that curve, there's this feeling of exhaustion. So we might feel as though we can't muster up the energy. And so the question becomes, what can we do? And there's a lot of things conventional medicine teaches us. We can certainly talk to a professional. We can see our doctor, specifically if we're feeling hopeless or feeling a lot of anxiety that's causing us insomnia or some levels of depression. We can see a doctor, we can talk with a counselor. Oftentimes, even medicine is needed if somebody's really suffering. But let's take a look at some natural integrative perspectives. And we're going to look at this slide now and towards the end of the talk. And what I would invite you to do when you look at this slide is take a little inventory. So act as though you're taking an inventory in your own life and ask yourself, how am I eating? And it's more important than you might think, because food is the only thing that builds our body and our brain, and we'll talk about it, but it creates the neurotransmitters in our brain and protects our brain. It has a lot to do with the way we think and our moods. So what are we putting in our body? Are we getting activity in our life? This doesn't have to be a marathon, but are we moving? Are we moving our body, exercising our heart and lungs? Are we getting sleep? Are we getting quality sleep? So thinking, writing off your little check marks. Are we utilizing any practices at all? And there are numerous to reduce stress. And we're going to talk about them. So don't worry if you're not checking off any of these boxes. And then we have healthy emotions. That's a pillar that oftentimes people don't think about. Then there is connection to others. And we have really seen the way people were isolated during this COVID year. And we are social creatures, actually, and we are meant for connection. When people become depressed and have pain, they often isolate, and that will create a downward spiral. So we have to start thinking about connecting. And are we connecting with positive people who inspire us? And finally, are we delving in, at least in a little way, into passion and purpose in our life? So we're gonna cover a few pieces with more energy and emphasis, but I'd like to touch on a few just to give everybody a little reminder for our checklist. We're going to come back to the checklist at the end. And if we are doing wonderfully at, say, 3 or 4 or 5, this gives you some insight into, okay, I'm doing some of these things really good, but I lay down at night and my mind races and I can't fall asleep, and then I wake up 3 times. Maybe some stress reduction modalities would start to calm your brain and your nervous system. And so what we'll do here is, since we're with the Brain Injury Alliance and we're serving our wonderful clients with all things brain, we'll talk about the brain as our central centerpiece here. And we can talk about the brain, letting everybody know, if you're not familiar with this concept, it's really important to understand that just a decade ago, the brain was really seen as static and fixed. There was a time when it was thought that we didn't even create new brain cells, that the brain was fixed and it could only have so much healing. And of course, all cases, there's a huge range, but the brain is highly malleable. That's that word neuroplasticity, nerve cells, brain cells, plasticity, plastic. That means the brain is extremely malleable. And the most basic explanation of this, for those of you that say, well, what do you mean? Just take something as simple as, if you don't know how to play the piano and you take lessons for an hour a day, 3 days a week for a year, soon you're playing this piano with some level of skill. And what's occurring is you're creating new neuronal connections. And so we know we can create new neuronal connections. We can actually have degeneration in certain parts of the brain, and we can have growth. And we can have this growth in the brain that we'll talk about just based on what we're thinking, which is really phenomenal. And if we look at it the other way, I took 2 years of Spanish in college, and I was doing a pretty good job of having some basic conversations and understanding. And then I went for years without using, and my Spanish skills really pared away because I was losing those neuronal connections. So understand that you can have a lot of hope knowing that at any age, any decade of life, we can improve our brain, and we can practice this neuroplasticity thinking about three specific pillars. The first is the environments we find ourselves in. Now, this environment might look a little extreme to you, but I often use this slide here when I talk to police, groups and individuals, and I describe the way environment affects the brain. So I think a police environment would be a really good way to explain this. So if I go to work every day at this beautiful wellness center that you see on the left side of the screen, it's just beautiful. It's nature. You see this beautiful water and flowers blooming, and it's just a delight. We know that nature is very healing for our brain and our cortex. And if we have a police officer that's going out and seeing violence and gruesome scenes, we know that just these environments will cause, say, we can see if we were in this scene here, that we would immediately move into fight or flight. And those stress hormones affect the brain. And then we can think about these environments a little bit more in a few minutes. But the second pillar is our behaviors. So right now we're talking about the three ways in which our brain is affected on a daily. So first is environment, second is behaviors. So something as simple as eating a healthy diet and exercising every day. We know, I don't have to tell anybody that we know that exercise reduces our chronic disease potential. And we know that eating healthy protects our brain and protects our organs. But did you know that things like, there have been studies, well, how about did you see the movie Supersize, where the individual eats McDonald's every day? There's some fascinating, there is a study in the journal Obesity that discussed the way these individuals who were really struggling with morbid obesity had areas of the brain that had some degeneration. So a little bit more about that in a moment, but the behaviors we're partaking in every day are affecting our brain. And the very way that we think, and I won't spend too much time here because we're gonna spend most of our time here because this is really where the strong part of this talk comes in. But if you notice the individual in the park reading a book, or the man who's doing a nice meditation, what you have there is you have this reduction of stress hormones and this calming of the nervous system. If you get into states such as anger and chronic worry and anxiety, we all know probably from experience that these states tend to build. And I always give the explanation that the way we're thinking is, sometimes I liken it to wearing a path. If we walked through this tall grass and you did not see this path, the grass would just spring back up underneath our feet. But if we walked through this tall grass 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, a year, we would eventually wear a path in it. So kind of discussing the way in which we think becomes very habitual and routine. And oftentimes people feel stuck, but it's important to know that with some effort and awareness, we can change this. And we'll talk about that. So remember, at first I talked about the environment that you're finding yourself in is really important. I just like to point out that this psychologist, Robert Ulrich, he was the first person who did some studies on individuals recovering in hospitals from infections and showed that those with windows with beautiful garden views had faster healing times. And you can find this article if you see the very bottom, the journal Science. And we have learned since that nature will be very calming to the nervous system. It'll actually activate the prefrontal cortex, which we'll talk about, which is the area of the brain that you want to be activated for that calming sensation. So this is just a little screen that builds on that a bit more, that it talks about, they have measured everything from hormones and heart rate, brain waves, when an individual is in nature, and we see time and time again that nature is healing. Really interesting psychoneuroimmunologist named Esther Sternberg, who based her life's work on these studies of how nature can heal us. She had a rheumatoid arthritis that was somewhat debilitating and moved to Greece for a few years and had this profound healing experience. And that is where her work has been centered now for the past few decades, is just describing the way in which nature heals us. And you can see this now. These newer hospitals, children's hospitals, are trying to move from those white sterile walls and that very depressive type. We all remember it if you're old enough, and still many hospitals are that way, but you see children's hospitals now with gardens and areas outside where you can sit. And that's because those environments are very important when we're healing. They're important every day of our life, but they're extremely important if we're looking to heal. So get out into nature. Just to give a short piece, I love to talk about food, so I can't leave this out. And I like to say, it sounds crazy, but think about this concept that there is only one thing that builds our body, and that is what we're ingesting, our food. If you see a 3-year-old, your friend's 3-year-old, and you don't see the child for 3 or 4 years, you can tell they're in a brand new body. They have a brand new body, all their cells have turned over. Well, the same is true for us as adults. Every so often, every year or so, we essentially have a new body because our skin cells, liver cells, all of our cells die and they're reproduced. We can see that if we think about our skin or our hair, but it's happening in our whole body. So we need to think about, what are we using to build our body and what are we using to build our brain? So a few of my favorite little concepts are, think about 100 years ago. What did we have to eat? Well, probably not a whole lot more than fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, beans, whole grains, and then fish that were pulled out of a nice clean ocean that ate plankton, and some animals that grazed in a pasture. And what happened in around 1900 was we had the explosion of processed foods. And this began with trans fats. Crisco, you might remember Crisco was created in a lab, and they actually made cookbooks with every recipe utilizing Crisco and gave it out to homemakers. And we later learned in the 50s and 60s that there was this upsurge of heart disease. And so the take home is, we see these processed foods coming onto the scene, and if you turn the box over or the package of cereal, you see 20, 30, 40 ingredients, and you'll read about additives, colors, flavors, sweeteners, preservatives, thickeners, fillers. And if we don't even get boggled down on if it's making us hyperactive, if it's causing cancer, what exactly do our cells do with artificial colors, artificial flavors? What is our cell? What can our cell do with that? just an interesting question to ask yourself. And why do we have so much childhood attention deficit, asthma, eczema, allergies, cancer? We just see so much. And then a really interesting concept is this pleasure principle and sugar. And we have a pleasure center in the brain that's important so that we could survive as humans. We had to reproduce and we had to eat. And so pleasure was associated with these things so that we would survive as a humanity. But some, as we know, substances hijack the pleasure centers of the brain. And sugar is one of them. And I don't know if you recognize this, but I certainly do. If you say had a couple of donuts in the morning, you might notice that you're once again craving something sweet. Or if you're doing dessert at night before bed, which is a time for craving, then the next night you really want it, and the next night. So sugar is utilizing this pleasure pathway. It's essentially causing a dump of the neurotransmitter dopamine into the nucleus accumbens. That might sound a little technical, but it's basically this center of the brain is being flooded with dopamine, and it makes us feel, and it makes sense. If we were talking about a long time ago and we came up with a food when we needed to survive that was fatty or sweet, that was good because it would help us survive. It would put some meat on our bones. So now we still have that same, oh, this is good, you know, something real fatty or something really sweet. But the problem is we actually become addicted to these foods. The best way to navigate that is to do a fast, 3 to 5 days, get through that difficult period, and then you should notice yourself stopping the craving. You just have to get through those difficult days. There was a fascinating book written in 2015 called The Dorito Effect, and this is the premise. Animal and plant breeding in the United States and probably across the world has been so hyper sped for growing populations and for industry that essentially a lot of food has lost its flavor. I can remember my grandparents or parents saying things such as, well, a tomato doesn't taste anything. I see some people shaking their heads. Doesn't taste anything the way it used to. And I've also heard people say, I don't eat meat anymore, but I've heard people say that chicken legs used to be very small and breasts, and they used to be very flavorful. And this same thing happens with animal agriculture and food. So this billion-dollar flavor industry stepped in to solve the problem. But here's the problem with that is these manufactured chemicals not only incentivize us to eat more and be addicted. Think about those Doritos. I remember being a kid and just loving those nacho cheese Doritos, just absolutely. And the same goes with these other foods that you get that are full of flavor. That orange powder that you lick off your fingers, that is this flavor industry. So not only does it incentivize us to eat more and get us addicted, but unfortunately they lack satiety chemicals. And what that means is if you eat a piece of salmon tonight and a big salad and a fruit salad, there are natural satiety chemicals in that natural whole foods that'll tell us, I'm full, I feel really good and satisfied. Whereas if we're eating Doritos and donuts, we don't really get, we might feel really full and sick for a while, but then we have that feeling again. So we're missing out on a lot. And then not too much to say here. This is just a quote unquote protein bar. Just take a look at all the ingredients. Once again, those fillers, we think, hey, I'm busy and I'm gonna just have this healthy protein bar, right? And look what's in it. Just again, what are we putting into our body? And then just being cognizant that there are cancer-causing chemicals in foods that really haven't been pulled, and so we have to be responsible. So just getting the information. So knowing that some of our processed meat, like bacon, deli meat, ham, and hot dogs, they've been linked to colorectal, pancreatic, and stomach cancers. And I'm sure everybody's heard when you grill red meat and you get that charred area, it releases a carcinogen, those heterocyclic carcinogen chemicals. And then they've removed a lot of these PFOAs, but they used to exist inside the bag of microwave popcorn. So just really important to be cognizant of some of these things. High fructose corn syrup, the number one place you might find high fructose corn syrup is in soda. So maybe like a Coke or a Pepsi. And we know now that high fructose corn syrup has a direct link to obesity, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, fatty liver, and a variety of dementias. So getting rid of, and that kind of goes back to that, if we can eliminate our sugar artificially, that would be wonderful for the brain. And that slide just basically shows, I won't spend any time there, but it shows that our soil has lost nutrition from the overproduction and the over-tilling. And so foods that used to have a very high degree of vitamins and nutrients like magnesium have declined. And trans fats, spoke about them a moment ago, but definitely make sure you're not eating trans fats. They increase our bad cholesterol, they increase our triglycerides, they increase our risk for heart disease. So some potato chips and donuts and margarines have trans fats. So if someone in your family has heart disease, make absolute certain that they're absolutely not getting any trans fats. And I'm not going to get stuck on factory farming. I always like to just say one or two things about factory farming. If you fish a fish wild caught out of the ocean, or if you have an animal on a pasture, that's a lot healthier than the large industrial factory farming, because they give the animals a lot of antibiotics for the overcrowding and hormones, and they feed them soy and cornmeal. And so those aren't healthy sources. It'd be much healthier if you could possibly, if possible, grass-fed, grass-finished, pastured animals and wild-caught fish. The larger fish tend to eat a lot of small fish and have more toxins in them, so you stay away from the larger fish, such as the big tunas and whatnot, because again, they're eating a lot of small fish and they're getting that high level of toxicity. So if you want to have just a real simple, easy Mediterranean diet, anti-inflammatory diet, have the most evidence for a reduction of chronic diseases. I think everyone's heard about the anti-inflammatory and the Mediterranean diet, but if I could just say one other thing is, if really focus on getting a lot of plants, vegetables, fruits, nuts, seeds, whole grains, beans as your base, and then move up the pyramid from there. So just a minute or two on environmental health, because environmental health affects our brain. And I'll tell you one way in particular. So just a few little pieces. Think about your plastic at home. If you do have food in Tupperware, transfer it to glass before you microwave it. We don't want to get that plastic leaching into our food. If you can purchase these glass Tupperware containers, that would be great. And think about the things we're putting on our skin: makeup, lotion, soap. Think about the products that you're using at home. Maybe you sometimes I like to spend a half a day just really cleaning. And if I remember before, when I had some products that were not so healthy, I would get a really bad headache. So these can have some really damaging chemicals, these products. And there are healthier products like 7th generation and Dr. Bronner's. There's a lot of really healthy chemicals that you can use to decrease your load of toxicity in your home, on your body, and ingesting into your body. So I just want to say one thing about pesticides. A lot of people ask the question about buying organic. Yes, there can be a certain amount of pesticides on our organic foods, and organic can be, as we know, more expensive. So you can Google the Dirty Dozen, and it will tell you the 12 most highly contaminated fruits and vegetables. And if you can just focus on those organic, there are things like spinach, strawberries, blueberries. They have a thin skin, and that pesticide can just really get in there. If it has a great big thick peel, like a banana, you're a little safer, but look up the Dirty Dozen. But there has been a link with Parkinson's disease and pesticides. And if you're interested at all in this, you can look up the 2014 article in Scientific American. And the way they found it was actually that individuals who were addicted to a certain drug were presenting into the emergency room hospitals with Parkinsonian-like tremors. And they found that the dealer of these drugs had laced it with something. And when they looked at this substance, it looked a lot like a certain pesticide. And so then they said, well, all of a sudden they turned their attention to this pesticide Parkinson's link. And so when I was practicing family medicine, I would always ask individuals who had Parkinson's. Oftentimes they would be somebody who grew up on a farm, or some kids used to chase down the pesticide cropping planes, and they would play in that mist. And it's really unfortunate that now we know that there is a link. So just something to be cognizant about, the health of our food. And just something that a lot of people don't know, the dietary supplement industry is very large, and I'm sure that everybody on here watching maybe takes one supplement. I like to take vitamin D and a B complex and CoQ10. And if you see that down below, if it has a label that says USF, NSD, or Consumer Labs, that just means that they've had a third-party inspection. They tend to be more well-respected and safer. So just something to know. And we're still on that pillar for the brain and keeping ourselves healthy on our what behaviors we're participating in. So we were talking about food, just a little piece on exercise. When we exercise, we do flood our brain with brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which allows our brain to actually be more malleable to healing. And not only that, we also have endorphins when we exercise. So we get more of those neurotransmitters, dopamine and serotonin. That's why sometimes when we go exercise, we feel better. And sometimes you notice you even feel more creative when you exercise. And then sleep is super important. We know that our brain detoxes when we sleep. And something of importance that a lot of people don't know is our brain is detoxing beta amyloid plaque that builds up in the brain of Alzheimer's individuals. So it's actually detoxing that plaque when we sleep. And so we're also taking the storage of the short-term memories into long-term, and a whole variety of wonderful things are happening when we sleep. So we're going to move into that third pillar now, because burnout, if we think about burnout, and if we're not even talking to anybody on here who is a healthcare provider, but let's just say you're dealing with a high level of stress. Let's say you're worrying a lot or having a lot of anxiety. We're just going to start off by looking at the brain, and I'll just keep it really straightforward for some basic concepts, and then we'll talk about the ways in which we can start tweaking little things in our life to reduce that anxiety, to reduce those stress levels. So I talk about this concept just so we can all see how stress affects our brain. As Carrie with the Brain Injury Alliance knows, that the brain is super complex. It's not this simple, but just for simplicity's sake, I break it down into these 3 parts. That green area you see has a lot of the activities that are autonomic or automatic, meaning we don't have to tell ourselves to do things like for our heart to breathe, or I'm sorry, for our heart to beat, and for our blood pressure and our balance or our digestion. We don't have to tell ourselves, so they're automatic. That's that green area. And then that red area of the brain is our limbic, our emotional brain. It's also where our fight or flight response starts. So for real simplicity, sometimes when I'm describing this, I call that the stress center, because when we become really stressed, if we have an argument with somebody, or we're almost cut off in traffic, or something happens that causes us to go into fight or flight, it begins in that area, that red area. And then that blue area that you see all over the top and around, that's called our cortex. That's where our higher brain functions are, specifically in the front here, behind the forehead, the prefrontal cortex. Carrie talks a lot about that when she describes the brain and why that part of our brain is so important. It allows us to plan and prioritize and make really good decisions. It's where our personality lies. We kind of liken it to our executive, our CEO. We sometimes call it the White House, because all the executive functions are happening there. We want it to be really healthy. And so that little red dot that you see lives in that red stress brain. It's called our amygdala, and it's kind of like the fire station. When we get something that comes into the environment that stresses us out, this might be that we see a bear when we're hiking, or it could be an argument, but this amygdala gets the signal and sends the information so that our body can be flooded with stress hormones so that we can prepare. Essentially, fight or flight, as you all know it, we can be prepared to deal with and fight the situation or flee from it. And so what happens when we're chronically stressed is this stress part of the brain becomes more robust. It has, under functional MRI scanner, those can see where the activity is occurring in the brain. That's what a functional MRI scanner looks at. So if you've got this chronic stress and you're utilizing this part of the brain, there's obviously going to be more activity in that part of the brain. There's going to be more blood flow in that part of the brain. And ultimately, we know our brain is plastic, right? Remember? And so we can even get more size in this part of the brain. And that's not something we want. And that also is the impetus when we start talking about post-traumatic stress and amygdala hijack, where individuals are stuck in this trauma cycle. And so that part of the brain that we talked about, that really healthy part of the brain, this prefrontal cortex, this part of the brain, we want to make really good decisions. We want to have impulse control and have the ability to feel calm and relaxed and relax the stress part of our brain. I won't get too deeply into this. What I really wanted to show with this piece is that when we're chronically stressed, the stress part of the brain is being worked more. And it does it at the detriment of this healthy part of the brain. Because if we're stressed, we really should not be focusing on analyzing the stock market or having an intelligent conversation. We should only be dealing with that stressor. And so this part of the brain takes a hit. It actually, we have some vasoconstriction that happens and it goes offline. So again, I'm not going to I want to save plenty of time to go over different modalities. Stress also affects our hippocampus, our hippocampus is a part of the brain that's responsible for new learning, storing memories, and cortisol, the stress hormone that can flood through our body and our brain, can be really damaging. It can be neurotoxic to this part of the brain. And it might be why when we're really stressed out, we say, oh gosh, I can't remember anything, because our hippocampus has taken a hit. So this is a really busy slide, and don't get overwhelmed by it. But the first way in which we can start to move into that third area, we talked about the environments that we find ourselves in. We talked about the behaviors we're partaking in. So whether that's, what are the foods we're eating and putting into our body, or are we exercising? Are we sleeping well? Now we're kind of moving into the way we think and our stress. And so again, this is a really busy slide, and it does say meditation because this is a wonderful modality, but it could be any contemplative practice that you use. And instead of getting caught up on this slide, if we're having a lot of stress and we're constantly utilizing the stress center of the brain, what we want to do is we essentially want to take ourselves from that constant stress where our nervous system is overactive, where we're always feeling on edge, we're always feeling amped. Maybe you notice that again when you lay down at night and you can't turn off the mind. When we feel overactive in the body and the nervous system, when we do a contemplative practice, so that could be that meditation, it could be doing yoga, it could be doing breath work, it could be in prayer, it could be a contemplative practice, it could be sitting in nature. But what we're doing is we're pulling the lever back on that fight or flight nervous system, and we're shifting our nervous system into what's called rest and digest. And also, if we think about that center of the brain that we talked about, that stress center of the brain, maybe it's the constant worry, maybe it's the worrying about the job or the financial situation or some issue that you're struggling with, or a family issue. That's that constant rumination. When we participate in a contemplative practice, we start to allow ourselves to quiet the mind. I don't know how clear that is, but I would move back up and show that fire station there, that those alarms go off when there's an argument or stress or anxiety. When we utilize those contemplative practices, we quiet this center down. And if we do it over and over and over again, we simply start to heal that. And then this part of the brain, this healthy part of the brain, is flooded with blood and activity when we're doing a contemplative practice like meditation or breath work or sitting in nature or getting a massage, because we're not in that stress brain. So I can answer questions on that if that was a busy slide, but the take home on that is that what we want to start doing is, if our nervous system is overactive, we want to start every day bringing our nervous system back to rest and relax, so that we can ultimately gain a middle ground. And then a second way that we can achieve this, and if we have time, which we will, and if you're able to stay on, we can practice a few of these, and then you can get an experiential and see what this feels like. But one of the ways that we can affect our own, it's called the vagus nerve. And when we activate that vagus nerve, it puts our nervous system into rest and calm. And there are many ways to activate the vagus nerve, one of them in particular is by using different breathwork techniques. And there's a whole variety of them, and we'll practice a few of them if you have time, and you'll immediately feel the shift. Take us from fight or flight all the way into the resting nervous system. And you can practice on your own twice a day, and what you're really doing is toning your own nervous system. And then just be cognizant that our emotions affect our health. They affect our body and our brain. And if that sounds foreign to you, just think for a moment. Think about the last time you were super angry. If you can think of a time when you were really angry, think about the way you felt. It might have been that your heart was beating fast, your neck might have felt tense. Some people get a throbbing headache. Some people even get a bulging vein, but you can feel, it doesn't feel good, and you can feel it in all of your body. And this is occurring because what we're feeling and thinking affects our body, because we're one, we're not a separate unit. And so we can begin to think about actually practicing. It sounds odd at first, but you can actually start practicing positive emotions. And there's a variety of ways that we can do this. There's different contemplative practices where you just simply sit down. If you just had an argument with somebody, or you're feeling down or anxious, and you were to go sit in a chair in your home quietly and close your eyes and start listing off a gratitude list, just feeling grateful that you have a bed to sleep in, that you have water to drink and food to eat. It's almost impossible to be angry. And we can sit down and actively start participating, and we can create a 10-minute block in the morning to do this. And we don't talk about happiness very often. Happiness is something that we don't talk about, especially in medical school. You learn a lot of disease processes, you learn a lot about pharmaceutical drugs, but we don't talk about healthy emotions. And we never talked about happiness. And what we come to learn from a neuroscientist that I love, that he's done a lot of decades of study on joy and happiness. And what he came up with was that our natural state is joy and happiness. And describing that, if you just take a look at children across the globe, take these 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds, and as long as their needs are being met and they're being taken care of, you can see the natural state of children if you witness them anywhere on the globe. And they're generally living in the present moment. They're extremely curious and creative. They're non-judgmental. They have boundless energy. They play, and they have infinite joy. And essentially what happens is life happens. We start forming our ego at about age 5, and people tell us what is right and what is wrong. And we start having the bigger hits. Maybe the parents were divorced. Maybe there was some abuses that occurred. Maybe you lost loved ones. And it's not that we lose the ability to be joyful, it's that it's buried. It's still our natural state. It's just buried sometimes under layers of an onion. And so there are some ways to recultivate this joy that's available to all of us. And a lot of it has to do with going inward. This is a concept that it's a little harder concept, and we can talk about it later if anyone's interested, but there's this concept called object referral. And what that means is that as humans, we've learned to tie our happiness to person, places, and things. And that's called object referral. And that is being happy when we finally find that other person or when we get that dream job. But the problem is, as soon as those circumstances change, that soulmate found another mate, or you lose that dream job, then we're sad and we're dependent now on these externals for our joy. And self-referral is when we learn how to cultivate joy from within, and then any of those externals just become bonuses. And so another way, there's many ways we can start returning to this state of joy. One of them is to heal and to process our old emotions and to deal with the things we need to take care of. But returning into the present moment, if you're sitting on a beach with your feet in the sand and you're biting your nails and you're thinking about what happened last year or 10 years ago, we're in the past and we're ruminating. It might feel very sad. And if we're thinking, if we're in the future, we might be saying, oh goodness, what's going to happen with this and my to-do lists. And so we're really not right here, right now. But if we bring ourselves into the present moment and we can start doing that, it's a skill, but we can do it through mindfulness. And it's just a returning to the present moment. So you might practice it today. You might go into your backyard if the weather's nice, if you have a nice tree, and practice. Tell yourself for 5 or 10 minutes, you're not going to think about the past. You're not going to worry about the future. You're just going to breathe in and out, feel what it feels like to be resting in your chair, feel the air on your skin, the sun shining on your face, listen to the sounds of the birds. And for 10 minutes, be right there. And that's where we really find joy. And then when you're laying down in bed at night, the next day, and you notice I'm worried, I'm worrying, or I'm sad and ruminating, you can tell yourself for 5 minutes, and it becomes a skill. Everything's about a skill, right? Some of these things we don't know about, but now we do. We have awareness, so we can start to practice. And your new skills, whether it's sitting down in gratitude or these things that we're talking about, it's like today we walked the tall grass path and the grass sprung right back up. But if we do it today and tomorrow and for 3 months and 6 months, we're going to get better at it. Absolutely, without a doubt. I like to just point out laughter because it essentially stimulates our immune cells. And we talked about gratitude. It's a wonderful way to get out of any type of anxiousness or sadness, just repeating a gratitude list. And one of the things that has helped me out in past times, difficult times, is setting a goal. For everybody, it's different. It could be for you that it could be very simple. I'm going to quit eating sugar for 5 days, or I'm going to walk a mile every day for 30 days. It could be a really big goal. It could be that I'm going to write a book. But setting a goal is one way to really up the production of dopamine in the brain and keep ourselves in this mode of challenge and just keeping ourselves on point every day. And then this concept of mirror neurons, a real area that I love that I won't go into, but it's a complex neural network in the brain. And it's essentially the way when we're caretaking, say for your baby, and you stick out your tongue at baby, and then they stick out their tongue at you, it has to do with these mirror neurons. And it's the way that we really truly connect with each other eye to eye in a profound way. And so make sure that you're not isolating and that you're connecting with individuals who are uplifting and lifting you and giving you some joy, just that connection. And this is just a slide that reconnects us with the passion and purpose. If there's anything that really brings you joy, if there's anything that you do that you lose time doing, so do you lose time when you write poetry, or do you lose time when you're baking in the kitchen? If you lose time, it's most likely a passion of yours if you lose time. And so if there's anything that you have that's a passion or purpose that the dust has built and you haven't thought about it in a while, you don't have to create a new career out of it. You can essentially just spend an hour on a Sunday just reconnecting with that. And so before we move on, I want to turn back around, because this part of the brain, it's actually in the cortex. And empathy, our ability to be empathic, to have empathy for another, has to do with areas of our brain. And when we become very stressed and we get into that stress brain and we're burnt out, and there's a lot of studies on this, that our empathy actually declines. It actually decreases. And that's not just for healthcare providers, but that's for police populations and all kinds of populations, even caretaking. If you're caretaking and you're absolutely, utterly burnt out, you might have experienced this in your own life. Your empathy will actually decline because of these complex neural networks in the brain. So when we start taking care of ourselves, it's kind of like that. Being on the airline, you put on your own mask first, and then you put on the person next to you. Because once we start taking care of ourselves again, then we will have more empathy and more of an ability to help take care of other people. So a healthcare provider who creates an empathic connection is engaging a complex network, and it has an effect on the therapeutic outcome. This might just be interesting for you if you're not. So essentially what that means, if you have a doctor or a therapist you're seeing, and they just see you for 2 minutes and say, well, here's your medicine, I'll see you in 3 months, you feel that. And if you have somebody that sits down with you and cares about you and looks into your eyes and listens to you, there's therapy in that alone. So whether you're the patient or the therapist or the doctor, this empathy can, in certain cases, have a greater healing effect than medication. And so that's why I place this here. If there's any healthcare providers, just remembering that we're not only taking care of ourselves, but we're taking care of other people. And I've absolutely noticed in my own life, when I'm the most stressed or struggling, I become unable to take care of other people. And so those are the main points. And then if we look back now, after hearing about these different pieces, let's go back and just take a little inventory and think about, how am I eating? What am I putting into my body? Am I putting a lot of chemicals into my body? And am I getting any activity in my day? And many people have limitations. There might be back pain or osteoarthritis or rheumatoid arthritis. There's typically always something we can do, whether it's even getting into a pool or doing chair yoga. If a person has limitations, there's always something we can do. Exercise is so good for the brain, lifting our mood, preventing Alzheimer's and dementias, having more energy throughout the day. Sleep is so important. There's so many chronic disease states linked with a lack of sleep. Stress reduction, that comes in the way of what little practice can you place into your day. It might be a 15-minute practice every morning. You wake up and move into a chair when the rest of the house is asleep. It could look like, it could be a hybrid. Some people tell me I journal for 5 minutes, I pray for 5 minutes, and then I do breath work for 5 minutes. Some people tell me they meditate for 20 minutes. It can be any hybrid you want. I found in my own life that if you get out of bed, go to the restroom, because everyone has to do that, and then move into your space, it is the most auspicious thing you can do, because as you check on emails and do other things, there's a less of a chance you're going to do it. So I recommend 20 minutes of quieting the mind completely, where you can be in silence. You'll notice the effect that it has on your day. And so finding a contemplative practice for you, and then practicing healthy emotions. There's a lot, that's a really loaded topic there. A lot to say about it if anyone has any questions, whether it's sitting down and actually having yourself sit down and think about positive emotions or gratitude or love for a set period of time. And then connecting, are you connecting? You ever notice that if you feel really down, you feel like you just don't want to do anything, but then you went ahead and you had lunch with your sister, or you did something that you feel better? Or maybe you went out and volunteered for an hour and you feel better. That connection piece is really important. And then honing into passions and purpose. And so, Kristen, I know we have a little bit of time, so we can do a variety of things. We can spend a few minutes where I go through a little bit of where I take everybody through an experiential, so they can feel what it feels like to calm the nervous system. You think?
Great, yeah. I am going to stop the live Facebook feed in case anybody has any questions during this time. I didn't want them to feel inhibited by that.
Okay.